Well, now that I'm sporting some sexy face scars again, I figured it's time to talk about disability. Again. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking not about books. Today we'll be doing my annual, I guess, conversation about stuff that has to do with disability. Excuse me if my voice is still somewhat rough and I'm still somewhat stumbling over words. It's not even 8 in the morning, but I have to leave soon, so I figured I'd record something before I do that. Anyway, this has been a long time coming, so let's actually do this. The context first, and then I'll give you a bit of the structure, and then we'll get through all of this, right? Okay, let's get started. Oh, and yeah, normal book stuff will happen again very soon, don't worry. But as I said, this has been a long time coming, and I wanted to talk about this because I feel sometimes I have to, and I'll explain why I feel I have to near the end. So let's do that, all right? And if you don't want to deal with this, that's totally fine. You don't have to listen to me talking about disabilities. And if you feel sort of, emotionally impacted by those kind of conversations because you maybe have some form of disability and are struggling with it, that's also totally fine. The next one will be, next book video will be about Sacrifice of Fools by Ian MacDonald, which is all about the Northern Irish conflict, and I'm pretty sure that will be a lighter topic. Anyway, let's get started with the context. All right. See, on the one hand, I feel like sometimes I have to talk about disability. Today I want to talk about disabilities. Mostly, I'll be talking about visible disabilities. That's an important part here because I'll be talking about stuff that other people recognize and how we deal with disabilities and how that can be difficult, how that can be problematic in all kinds of ways and maybe ways forward. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about like how disabilities are perceived by people, both by people without disabilities or with different disabilities or handicaps, and by those who have one. And obviously, in this case, some disabilities or handicaps are easier to be perceived than others. Like if I walk into a place somewhere out there, not sitting in front of my camera, where you just complain that I don't actually stare right into the camera, which I'm, sorry for. But if I walk around somewhere out there, I'll have a stick. So if I enter a place, everyone there will notice that I'm blind. If you sit in a wheelchair, everyone will notice that you have some form of disability that forces you to use a wheelchair. Now, if you have something like diabetes, your closer friends will probably know that you have that as a chronic illness, but I can't actually see that notice that if you just if I meet you randomly in a bar or something. And that's one thing that makes sort of like the first reactions we have to people with disabilities different depending on what's going on. And I just wanted to bring that up in the beginning. This will not matter too much. I think it can matter when it comes to sort of like first encounters and stuff like that, and obviously first impressions carry through, but it is just like the first step. In general, we'll talk about handicaps that the people that we interact with are aware of, and that is sort of the next thing. And that is, first, we'll talk about how other people see people with disabilities, and we'll talk about how it is to live with a disability, knowing that other people know about your handicap, and then we'll move on into where that leads, and then we'll talk about maybe how to, move beyond that, at least somewhat, if possible, and then I'll just leave it and hope it's not too depressing. Sounds like a plan? Let's get started. Now, I've often spoken, well, not often, but from time to time spoken about agency and how we as humans depend on having agency, and how that's sort of like the key thing through which we define ourselves. There's in fact like actual studies on that that I can't pull up right now because I'm improvising, of course, but I can find them again, that sort of like the development of like self, of a self or understanding of self comes with children. It's like developmental psychology comes with the moment when we can in fact interact with the world. If you've ever seen like small babies, as soon as they can actually bang on something and it makes a noise or whatever, they'll repeat that again and again and again, because it kind of shows us that we can interact with the world, right? So agency is a key feature of being human in a very, very fundamental way. Now, of course, what we know with disabilities, it's kind of in the title already. It means that we are unable. People with a disability are unable to do something. One ability to interact with the world is at least inhibited. It doesn't actually fully function. So that's the first form of like where disability lies. And I think like looking at these words does help to understand this. Now that means that with a disability, we sometimes lack agency. And that is how other people see us. Now, obviously, it's something that I personally encounter from time to time with friends, but also like other people. It's like, they assume that because I'm blind, there's a lot of things I can't do. And they're obviously right, but we'll talk about where they're right and where they're wrong in a moment. They are obviously right that there are some things that I can't do. Now, on the other hand, they'll probably assume that there's things I can't do that I'm perfectly able to do. For example, I've certainly helped a lot of people move house over the years. And there's still, every time I offer to help someone when they're like, I gotta move house, I'm like, yeah, sure, I can help. They're like, you can't help? I mean, you can't see. It's like, look, it's not about seeing. If I have to carry a fucking washing machine, I won't do that alone. I can just like help carry stuff. It's not that impossible for me. Now, if I was sitting in a wheelchair, that would be a different matter, of course. But see, there is a tendency to sort of overestimate the impact a disability can have on your lives and sort of underestimate people with disabilities. That is certainly out there, and it can lead to something later, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So there is that, like having an accurate assessment of the sort of like capabilities of any human is obviously basically impossible. You can't do that for like friends that you are not aware of having any disabilities whatsoever, right? You can't gauge someone's capabilities fully ever. You have to trust them when they say like, yeah, I can do this or I can't do this. Up to a point, there is a level of trust. Now, for whatever reasons, that trust is harder to come by when you're talking with people with disabilities, or that's at least my experience over the years, that like when I say I can do this, there's a lot of people who just assume that I can't actually do this, and I'm just saying that because I want to fit in or whatever. That's just like something that has happened over the years. And then people are incredibly surprised when I am able to do something that, yeah, of course I'm able to do this. People are incredibly surprised and praise me over into the high heavens because I'm able to carry a box. And I'm like, yeah, sure. It's like, what do you think? That is just one key point, is like how we are taught to see people with disabilities. It's certainly something that over the last, say, century, 1.5 centuries or whatever, we have certainly sort of like put people with special needs, people with disabilities and so forth in this very specific box of like, they don't fit in, they are incapable of partaking in full society, so we need to be careful and sort of, well, we don't let them just die anymore, at least in the West, or then, the global north. We don't just let them die anymore, but we flip to the opposite side. We just like coddle them and let them do like basically nothing. That is just like societal in a lot of ways. So that's the first part. The second part is, and this is I think important, how we as people with disabilities see ourselves. And don't worry, we'll go somewhere with this. How people with disabilities see themselves. Now, I can't speak for anyone else, right? I'm speaking with my own experience, and I'm trying to extrapolate something larger here, but it's based on my own experiences. If your experiences are very different, please let me know in the comments. This is your call to action. I'm doing engagement here, right? Anyway, so here's the thing. There are, of course, things that I can't do. They sometimes are silly things, and they're often very, very personal. There's stuff I can do, and there's stuff I can't do, right? I can go shopping in near a store for groceries, at least as long as I'm going to buy the same things that you kind of know where they are. I know where the pizza is, and I know where the beer is, right? I'm a former computer science student. I can do this on my own. If I need something else, I'll suddenly have to ask. Now, if I would have to go and buy clothes, for example, I would probably have to ask a friend or someone there at the store to help me, and suddenly that's something I can't do. I feel like can't do. It's basically impossible to do that. So there are clear limitations to my very specific possibilities. Now, someone with like also some form of visual impairment in some way, shape, or form that sees slightly better than me, but still, has other needs, right? They can probably go buy clothes themselves still, and so it's very much a personal thing in that regard. But there are certainly things where I need help. and this is the next important thing here, there are things that people with disability are physically absolutely incapable of doing. And the problem that we're going to talk about here first now is power imbalance. Because this leads to a power imbalance. Power imbalances are all over the world, and I'll give some historical context in a second, but it leads to power imbalances. And if I have, and the problem is these power imbalances are sort of like one key issue when it comes to all kinds of social relationships, whether it's friendships or actual, partnerships or whatever you want to call it, like romantic relationships and so forth. These power imbalances are always there. Because see, if I have, say, a flatmate or friend and so forth, and they are much shorter than me, right? Not that I'm that tall, right? And there's like a box or something on top of a shelf, and they ask me if I can just help them put that thing down or whatever, right? Because they can't reach it right now. Then I can do that, and there is technically a power imbalance there, but it's not exactly a hard one. They could just like carry over like a chair or a stepladder or whatever. It just means more effort, and because we're friends, I'll gladly take that over and go like, yeah, sure, I'll do it because I'm a nice guy in that situation. Now, if I ask a friend if they can help me, buying clothes or help me get somewhere where I just can't go, because I need a car or whatever, because it's not reachable by public transport or whatever, right? There are hard limitations there. I need that help. So if they refuse, I don't have an option to just do something else to get that done. Whereas in that former example, my friend could have just, gotten that stepladder or chair or whatever. It would have taken longer, but it was not that hard of a power imbalance. With a disability, there is a hard power imbalance. And that makes any form of relationship, friendship, partnership, whatever you want to call it, very, very difficult, because these things have to be eye to eye, so to speak, on the same, like on a level playing field, because at that point, any sort of like thing I do for the other person is because I like them, not because of a sense of obligation, because a sense of obligation makes it sort of difficult to then for the other person to refuse anything, because you're like, yeah, you helped me when I could really not do this, so I cannot refuse at this point, because and so forth. It leads to feelings of guilt, obligation, and so forth, and those are obviously poison for any form of friendship, partnership, relationship, whatever. So that's the underlying issue. Now, historical context. This has always been the case. It's not just a disability thing. Like, just look back a couple of decades, and women were not allowed to work unless their husbands allowed them. They were not allowed to have, driver's licenses, and not allowed to have their own bank accounts, all kinds of these things. Those were also hard power imbalances that are built into the kind of system that we live in. It's patriarchy and so much more in this regard, right? So these things have always existed because they are what keeps a hierarchical structure going. And obviously the goal is to dismantle those, because at the end of the day, having no power imbalances makes for much richer personal interactions in any way, shape or form. Now, as I said, with, say, the things that feminism has already accomplished over the last 50, 60, 70, well, roughly 100 years, basically, in the West, those things have gotten better for women in that regard. But those were things that were like in there by design. So what do you do when we talk about stuff that are, at the moment, hard physical limitations that create those power imbalances? And that's kind of the point that I wanted to get to, because this is not the law telling me I can't drive a car. This is me, I can't drive a car because I'll probably hit the next tree, well, maybe the second tree. You know what I mean? There are situations that I am just like physically incapable of. This is not man-made, so to speak, not created by humanity, not a legal fiction that kind of keeps the power imbalance in there. So we have a point where it is very difficult, a constant struggle for people with disabilities, or for people in any form of power imbalance, to have a rewarding relationship with other people that are not sort of at the same power level, so to speak. Power level sounds wrong, but you know what I mean. With people that have the same limitations and so forth. Having those kind of relationships is possible. We get there. The other part is, of course, it adds a constant level of stress and other things, right? I constantly feel guilty when I have to ask friends to help me. It doesn't matter whether they are willing to or not. it feels weird because they basically have no real choice to refuse, because they also know that if they say no, things won't happen, right? It's not about doing this out of your free will and out of, being nice, being friends and so forth. It is because you feel obligated to do it, and on the other hand, then I feel obligated I feel unable to refuse when they ask me for something and so forth. It loads a lot of guilt into any form of conversation, a relationship, friendship, and so forth. The question is, what happens then? And I'll go to 2 places here for a second, and then we'll hopefully go somewhere else. The first version is a troubling one, and I'll try to say this without coming across as a dick, and then we'll move on. One thing that often happens in these situations, and I think it's usually happening subconsciously, unconsciously, and so forth, is that people with those kind of disabilities, or people that are just not this, not the constant current societal mainstream or whatever, are pushed to the side, because it can be bothersome for anyone, right? It adds a mental load to anyone, even, not the people with disabilities, right? So there is a tendency to push these people sort of to the side and put them in the box that I will just call the weird ones is bad because of current political discourse, but the not like us people in general. And you kind of push those people to the side, and those people are often end up in sort of together for all kinds of reasons. In the bad version, this is what we call marginalization, right? You push them to the margins. In the sort of negative version, this means that all kinds of not being normal is a bad word here, right? But not being normal, I guess, is assumed as being one other condition. It's a binary. It's either you're the mainstream or you're not. And that leads to people with all kinds of different sort of personality aspects that make them not normal, ending up together. And that can help, but it can also be incredibly troubling. I've certainly experienced this, and this is where I said I don't want to make this sound like I'm a dickhead or anything, but my troubles with interacting with a sort of ableist and so forth world are different from the issues that someone in a wheelchair has. They're very different from the issues that someone with all kinds of mental health issues has, and so forth. So being sort of pushed by society, by other people, to interact with those other people that have their own very specific struggles with the world adds even more sort of struggle, adds even more issues, right? Because suddenly you have the double bind, it has a double pressure there. It's if the person in the wheelchair asks me to push them over to some other place, I'm suddenly the person that is not that doesn't have a disability. Suddenly I feel obliged to do that because they can't do it on their own. These are hypotheticals. Of course, people in wheelchairs are mobile. You know what I mean? On the other hand, if I can't see something, the person in the wheelchair feels obliged to do that. So suddenly you have that side of it. But on the other hand, you also have I'm the person with a disability. I'm bothering someone else. So you add even more mental stress there, which is something that certainly I've felt over the years when I was, pushed sort of by society to end up with a lot of people with all kinds of troubles and disabilities and so forth in situations where I felt completely overwhelmed, especially when you add certain forms of neurodivergence, mental health struggles and so forth in the mix, which sort of are easier to come by because you already have all that additional mental load that comes with having a sort of physical disability in a lot of ways, right? It can be incredibly stressful and lead down very dark roads and make you a very bitter, angry and sort of person. And that is where we come to the other part, which is you find your own. And for that, we have the internet. Don't worry, this is structured. We're going somewhere. We have the internet, and the internet has certainly done a lot there. You end up, even before that, you kind of have all these self-help groups, and you have groups where people with the same form of disability, handicap, whatever you want to call it, come together, talk about those kind of problems, because that's the one space where everyone sort of is the same and is on the same level, on the same boat, at least in that regard. And you don't have that additional sort of need to constantly communicate your absolute needs versus your, I'm just human, I want to help this, and so forth. It takes away that additional level of stress that I tried to explain at the beginning. These groups exist. They obviously have their drawbacks, because suddenly it's very easy to fall down like a very dark hole where you're mired just talking about the constant struggles that you have, and you kind of drag each other down, and it can lead to very specific weird places that are hard to navigate if you're looking at them from the outside, and that can certainly lead to despair. It's certainly my experience that can happen with a lot of these kind of groups. On the other hand, it can also feel good if you're suddenly finally understood by other people that get you. Now, we always had that with, like, at least in larger urban cities and so forth, where you can meet, where there's a chance of finding someone else who has similar struggles to you. The internet has obviously made that much more easy, because now we can talk to the entire planet, basically. And there's more people like us out there. There's a couple billion people out there. Chances are good you'll find someone with a very similar life story to yours. And you can bond over that, and you can finally talk freely, and you don't have to constantly explain because the other person gets you and so forth, right? That is good. Once again, however, this also, even on like a larger level, leads to sort of building in-groups, out-groups, policing the borders of these in-groups and out-groups, because the place where you hang out with the friends that actually get you, that's your safe space. That's the space where you're understood. So you don't want anyone else come in there and suddenly raise those mental costs that you have interacting with people that are not like you. That's one thing. There's a positive side here. There is a danger for this becoming negative. Now, I'm lucky that I have not encountered this much in like my personal, like, not that I take part in a lot of these kind of groups myself, but I'm lucky that I've certainly seen it from the outside with other groups that are tearing themselves apart, because suddenly you do a lot of like purity testing. You kind of police the borders of your specific in-group that is, all about your specific being differentness, to the point where it just like explodes in a lot of ways. It also leads to the fact that like you're just talking to yourselves, so the rest of the world won't even know what's going on, and you have a breakdown of communication. So how can we fix this, and where are we going with this? First part is technology, which is why I put the internet thing here already. Technology does help with a lot of physical disabilities. Assistive technology is a wonderful thing. Having a smartphone for me has been like a big deal, right? It talks to you. I can check train plans on my phone now. I can do so much stuff with my phone that makes it easier for me to do things on my own, to reduce the load of sort of having to ask other people, of feeling obliged to other people, feeling that I owe other people. It reduces that load. On the other hand, it obviously makes it easier for other people to interact with me, because they don't feel obliged to help me in situations where I can just like do this shit on my own. I should not use Google Maps to navigate unless I'm very safe where I am. But there's a lot of like assistive technology that does sort of level the playing fields, and that's the thing what that assistive technology does, right? It levels that playing field. It reduces the power imbalance that is inherent in having less agency in certain situations. It does give us agency back in a lot of ways. That's a good thing. It'll never be everything. It'll never be perfect. It also leads to another aspect. Some assistive technology is incredibly expensive. A lot of people can't afford it. And sometimes when it comes to commercial technology that is also helpful in an assistive way, there is additional stuff, right? I'm using an iPhone. I'm not a big fan of Apple products. I don't like the philosophy of the company and so forth. I think it's bad. On the other hand, iPhones have, like Apple products have the best assistive technology for blind people, for visually impaired people. I don't know why that is. There's a historical reason there, I'm pretty sure, but they do. Would I prefer to use Android? Yes. Is it at the same level? Not yet. Also, if I switch, it will take like months of figuring this shit out again, and that is additional energy, cost, and so forth that does have like all these real life knock-on effects. It's not that I'm slower with, using a new software. It's just, it means I'll have to ask people new stuff and, accrue more of these sort of like social and emotional debts, and that's troubling. And at the same time, being sort of like on the left of things, I have a lot of people sort of like shaming me for using the more expensive boutique, whatever you want to call it, iPhone instead of like a cheap or cool phone that is not run by this evil company. You know what I mean? And that is something that I've encountered before. It's like, hey, why don't you get like a cheap phone? It's like, I'm sorry, the cheap phone won't do it for me for like actual reasons that are beyond like I want to seem cool by having an Apple product. You know what I mean? And that is sort of like where we can add, like, if you meet people, and this is sort of like where I want to end this. If we meet people that have any form of disability, and they use technology that we think is excessive or has like additional like ethical concerns, right? I order a lot of stuff online, even on Amazon, because I can search stuff on a website with assistive technology and get exactly the thing I need, instead of going to a shop, having to ask humans whose time is precious, who are probably stressed out because, you know, people in those kind of jobs are usually stressed out and paid like shit, right? Without bothering everyone, without accruing all this mental load of stress and so forth. I can just do this on my own. It obviously has all kinds of terrible knock-on effects economically and so forth, but it reduces my personal mental load at that day. And that is something that I think is important to understand why people use things that we might find ethically troubling. We should ask them. It's like, hey, why do you do this? And sometimes it's more than just convenience. Sometimes convenience can mean the difference between a mental breakdown and no mental breakdown. And I think that is valid. So understanding why people are using certain technologies, I think, is important. That's the first part. The next part is communication. See, here's the thing. There is an additional cost. You know, I've spoken about like where we go to avoid those kind of mental costs. There's an additional cost here. As people with disabilities, very often it's very much on us to explain our situation, to communicate our situation, so we can figure out where these sort of like where the power imbalance lies, where the ends of my agency lie versus the ends of your agency. That's very often on us, and very often, sadly, it's exclusively on us. And sometimes I just don't have the energy. I just can't. I just fucking can't. So the question there is, how can we level that playing field as well? There is, I think, two ways of this. One is that when people with any form of marginalization have the energy, have the free mental space capacity to talk about it, to explain it, there is sort of like an implicit sort of like duty, not really duty, but you know what I mean. It can be helpful to explain stuff, because that maybe makes it less, that frees up someone else who just does also need the same sort of help, but doesn't have the energy right now. That frees that up. So we help someone by doing that. On the other hand, if we encounter people, we have those kind of just, we can try to sort of inform ourselves about other people's needs. The internet is a large place by now, and sometimes just like check out stuff that's different from us. Listen to people with different, backgrounds, different voices. Listen to people that are from different marginalized groups, and maybe build up sort of like a base understanding and kind of go from there. And then at the final point, when it's one-on-one, I don't know, just talk to people. I guess it's the main thing. Listen to people, assume that their troubles are valid before making judgments, then figuring out how to level the playing field, level the field of interaction with any other person as much as possible, because the more you are doing things because you just want to do them and not because you feel you have to, the easier it is to talk to other people. It does make things better for everyone involved. And that's kind of where I wanted to end this. And yeah, I got my scars because I ran into a lamppost on the way to the gym, and this one because I was carrying around some fridges and hit my head at the car trunk lid. Shit happens. It's part of the game. But it happens to anyone, and could happen to anyone, I guess. So it's not specific, but it will be seen as specific because there is this big sign saying, hey, this guy may be less capable than other people. That makes it easy to judge around that. So that's kind of where I end this for today. Talk to each other, understand why there is, what kind of cost there is connected to being different or being perceived as different, and that those are not necessarily the same thing. Talk to people, try to, have interactions on the same level playing field as much as possible. And have a good time. Once again, I'll talk about books again very soon. Until then, I don't know, like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you want to help me, share this if you feel like it, read some good books, do something fun. I'm going to go to Keep It True Rising and watch the last Sirith Ungol show in Europe. And I'll see you after that, and until then, thanks and cheers.